É um prazer e uma honra receber a Vanda Felbab-Brown, pesquisadora sênior do Brookings Institution. A doutora Vanda Felbab-Brown é pesquisadora sênior no Centro Strobe, Talbott, para Segurança, Estratégia e Tecnologia do Programa de Política Externa no Brookings Institution. É diretora da iniciativa on Nonstate Armed Actors. Possui doutorado em Ciência, Política, pelo MIT. E também bacharelado em Administração Pública em Harvard. Eu sou Atalá Correia, sou professor do IDP, coordenador do curso de Direito. E após falar da doutora Vanda, vou também passar para vocês um pouco da minha experiência como juiz em Brasília. So it is a pleasure receiving Dr. Vanda Felbab-Brown. In Brazil, we always talk by the first name. We're not acquainted to talk for the surname. Dr. Vanda, it's a pleasure receiving you here. Let's start our talk. You have around 20 minutes to do your talk. Thank you very much for your presence here.
Great. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be back in Brazil, in Brasilia, and I am really very impressed with the conference and impressed with you for coming also to share your thoughts. So my task is to speak about organized crime and urban security. And of course, public safety in the 21st century is increasingly determined by these two factors, by urban security, because cities are more and more not just the places where vast majority of people live, but also, in fact, arbiters of global power and global distribution of power. This is certainly true about very large cities. Consequently, how urban security is perceived by citizens, by businesses, and what kind of management suppression of organized crime there is in cities has fundamental implications, not just for the quality of life in the city itself, but also for the legitimacy of the state, and in fact, its very standing potentially at the international level. Yet, even as public security in cities, urban security is so important, it is also very much an unfinished job. Around in various parts of Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, as well as in European level, there is often a significant bias between what kind of security, social and economic opportunities and life people experience in areas of wealth, of affluence in the city centers, if you would like, in comparison to people who live in the poor, underdeveloped areas, be they comunas in Medellin or here in Brazil, favelas, in Rio, poor neighborhoods in Sao Paulo. And this bifurcation of life, of existence, has long been the case. It's not a new phenomenon in Latin America or, for that matter, around the world. What is a new phenomenon, however, now, is in Brazil, in Latin America, is that organized crime that emerged and grew up in these poor neighborhoods has burst onto the national scene and, in fact, onto the international scene. And this is acutely the case with Primeiro Comando da Capital, which is now operating not just in the poor areas, not just in local drug trafficking market, but infiltrating and increasingly involved in legal economies, in trying to influence political developments, in having access to mining, farming, logging, and also, of course, operating not just in Brazil, but in other parts of Latin America and beyond Latin America, in West Africa, in Europe, developing relations with major international organized crime groups. And just as the PCC has burst into the international scene, grown up from the slum boys into a powerful international crime groups, we see the arrival into Latin America, including of Brazil, of much larger organized crime groups from abroad. Across Latin America, a bipolar war between the Sinaloa cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación is radically reshaping local criminal markets, it's radically reshaping public safety, but it's also even changing politics. And of course, the two Mexican groups, dominant as they are, and much as they are driving violence up from Chile to Costa Rica, even in the so-called islands of peace, they are not the only actors. There is more and more presence in Latin America of organized crime groups from Europe and Asia. Certainly Chinese criminal groups are deeply involved in a variety of legal and illegal economies and expanding their presence. More of yet is to come. But at the same time, you also have the arrival of Bulgarian, Albanian criminal groups, increasing presence of the Balkan groups more broadly, including Turkish criminal groups. So a much wider mixture, and of course Italian groups like the Ndrangheta. So a much wider mixture of actors. This presents significant challenges and often quite acute policy dilemmas for law enforcement around the world, but certainly for law enforcement in Latin America. Because some of the quote-unquote solutions, some of the approaches that have developed to dealing with slums, to dealing with poor neighborhoods plagued by criminal gangs, are now no longer adequate for grappling with the same challenge, because they never truly transferred power and authority to the state, to police forces, let alone resolve the social needs, economic needs of populations that have lived there. So let me talk a little bit about the policies and their outcomes in the slums, and now what this means in interactions with the international criminal groups. So in much of the 1990s, law enforcement forces in Latin America dealing with poor neighborhoods would often have the following model. On the one hand, you have often negotiated deals with criminal groups, especially at the time when a criminal group was dominant in the neighborhood. So politicians would strike a deal, sometimes police forces would strike a deal with the local criminal group. Violence would go up when the criminal group wanted to bargain for more payoffs. The payoffs would come in the forms of a paved road for a few meters, or perhaps electricity being brought in. Essentially, the local criminal groups acted as social entrepreneurs on behalf of people, poor, underprivileged populations that were not given access to legal jobs, that were not given access to public services, often suffered enormous hardships, and had minimal political representation. And so violence and expression of violence through these local gangs became a mechanism of bargaining for services. Now, of course, the criminal gangs would be involved in illegal economies as well, most importantly, local drug dealing. So this was one way to kind of negotiate the payoffs, or the alternative response would be particularly violent incursion by state forces, police forces, or military forces into the neighborhood, into the poor area, but often without long sustained presence. So they would go in to arrest some members of the community, alleged gang members, perhaps gang leaders, and then they would go out. And the incursion, the presence of law enforcement forces would be deeply traumatic for the community, but yet would not change the basic structural issues in the community, the political capital that the criminal gangs were establishing. Over time, and of course, there were some exceptions to this, including, of course, very importantly, in Rio de Janeiro, more than a decade and a half ago, the effort to pacify the UPP policy, the effort to pacify the poor neighborhoods beyond simply these limited short-term incursions. And while a program that was meant to be designed on a much more robust scale and achieve lasting results, it ultimately suffered from all kinds of challenges, one of which was the speed with which local community sustained police forces were being created. The areas were being liberated or taken over far faster than the local community police would be able to be stood up and emerge and develop presence. But also issues of resources, financing, policy sustainability beyond 2 years, beyond an administration, became a challenge. And so veering between sort of the violent, limited incursions, the payoff bargaining, and these limited efforts to really retake the slum and bring the state permanently in, but with inability to sustain that effort and sufficiently resources, often led to essentially police forces reconciling themselves, and political leaders reconciling themselves to relegating governance to criminal groups. And this would become facilitated, this would become possible when one criminal group would gain dominance. So as long as you had many criminal groups fighting over the city, like in Medellin in the 1990s, violence would be very high up, the state would feel compelled to come in. The moment that a group won, often homicides went down. They would perhaps have homicides that would be domestic disputes or maybe local drug dealers fighting among each other, but the big homicides went down. That reduced the need for the political pressure. The market would now become arbitrated, and not just the market, the physical space would now become arbitrated by the criminal group that would be the governing entity, not just from the perspective of the people, but with some complicity or acceptance, tacit acquiescence by the state of allowing the group to bargain. And then some groups, like PCC or CV, or in Colombia's cases in Medellin, Oficina de Envigado, would take on all kinds of regulatory functions. They would even suppress homicides. Now that they were no longer fighting with their major rivals, they could afford to impose some level of market control, violence control on local drug dealing, for example. If they would allow drug dealing, but as long as the local drug dealers were not killing each other, they were fine with it, and they would limit predatory crimes to some extent. And when that happens, and this is not a rare phenomenon, it happens in Asia, in Africa, it happens in various parts of Latin America, the state feels less pressure from citizens to act. And so often the state would reconcile itself to relegating control of this kind, governance, to criminal groups, and it would be much cheaper than doing what is truly necessary, establishing permanent police presence that is legitimate, that is sustained, that is embraced by the community, and that in some neutral form delivers the rule of law. And it will be much cheaper in terms of physical resources than bringing in the social services that communities need, in bringing in legal justice services, so that the actor that delivers justice, delivers dispute resolution, is not the criminal group but by the state. Now the problem with this shortcut is twofold. The first problem all along with governance, relegating governance to criminal groups and living with a criminal governance that is not very violent, or at least less violent than turf war would be, is that this narco piece, this crime piece, is at the discretion of the criminal groups. The moment a rival outside criminal groups would come in, violence would spike up again. If the group splintered for whatever reasons, the crime would spike again, violent crime would spike again. And all of this also continues to either weaken or at least not increase the legitimacy of the state, while it continues to give political capital to the criminal group. So even when peace or less violence seemed to be taking place, it often did not mean that the state actually became stronger, that the state became more present, that it became more acceptable, let alone that police forces would develop greater deterrence capacity. And the second problem is the one that is, of course, now emerging. Some of the groups that have been able to rule the poor areas develop the ambitions and the capacity to grow beyond those local markets, local challenges, and become involved on a far greater scale at true mafia-like activities across the state, becoming involved in a much greater variety of illegal economies, but also increasingly seeking to penetrate legal economies, outright control legal economies. It's a phenomenon that is not taking place here in Brazil with PCC alone. We see that at an enormous scale in Mexico, where cartels like Sinaloa are involved in agriculture, logging, mining. They are taking over legal fisheries in the country. They are taking over water distribution, not just at the local poor neighborhoods, but at national level scale. So extraordinary thrust into legal economies, takeover of legal economies, and also a much greater interest and will to shape local politics, and perhaps even state and national level politics. Now, the second challenge is the one that I started talking with, that this is all now all the more complicated by the fact that we now have the presence of international criminal groups. And this is, and that the local slum boys are now big international businessmen, or criminal businessmen, if you would like. That enormously complicates the problem that law enforcement needs to fix. It brings the challenge of simply bringing in an accountable, sustained state, and a state that is efficient and delivers to communities, but also now needs to address the international dimensions. And so the complacency that the state could have with relegating the favelas, the comunas, to criminal groups are no longer acceptable, because international actors are saying, no, you cannot just let your own mafia do what it wants, because it's now creating problems for us. It's bringing drugs in massive quantities to Europe. It's subverting local orders in West Africa. And of course, the fact that you have outside actors, organized crime actors, is also generating a lot of friction. So, in the case of PCC, we really haven't seen a tripolar war between Sinaloa Cartel, Jalisco, Nueva Generación, and PCC. What is pushing violence in extraordinary levels up from Ecuador, Chile, through Costa Rica is the principal fight between Sinaloa and Jalisco, and the fact that they're demanding that their local allies, local vassals, proxies, deal only with one or another. So a lot of the fighting in Ecuador is fighting among local criminal groups, but on behalf or for the purposes of the two large cartels. And of course, the local criminal groups are not just taking their orders and bidding from the international actors, they are also learning from them. And they are learning from them that their ability to escape law enforcement, the ability to have power, to evade arrests, to deter the state from imposing rule of law goes all the more up, the more they become involved in legal economies, the more they take over crucial infrastructure places like ports. But I think that there is much more awareness in Brazil, and a lot of the conference today is about how much the PCC has emerged as this regional and international actor. But I think the really big issue to watch is, at what point do we end up in a situation where the bipolar war between Sinaloa Cartel and Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación now becomes a tripolar war. So the PCC has been principally active in places like Peru and Bolivia for many years, that had been using those places to source cocaine for distribution in Brazil, for distribution in Argentina, as well as to take cocaine in Europe. But of course, over the past 10 years, almost certainly since 2016, the FARC peace accords in Colombia, the PCC has developed much more inroads to sourcing cocaine from Colombia as well. And yet in Colombia, in addition to groups like the Gaitanistas, the Golfo Cartel, the Mexicans are very deeply present. So, and the Mexicans are bringing cocaine through some of the shared proxies like the Nandareta, but other groups, Turkish groups, into Europe as well. So far, we haven't really seen a major fight between Jalisco and Sinaloa and PCC, but this could happen. And when this happens, this becomes yet another driver of violence in Latin America, yet another enormous challenge for Latin American groups. What we are starting to see, even in places like Europe, is already a fight between Jalisco and Sinaloa over cocaine distribution market and methamphetamine markets. And Europe is a place that would have homicide rates 1 per 100,000, 2 per 100,000, very low levels. So even small numbers of homicides through the proxies of the two groups are significant because the homicide levels are so low. Not like in the Americas, in Latin America, where often homicide rates are in the tens per 100,000. We're also starting to see, the two cartels in even importing sicarios into places like Portugal and Spain to be engaged in this fighting over local control, not of retail markets, but of infrastructures, of critical infrastructure, of critical ports of entry. All of which, in my view, really presents a very worrisome dimensions to much more pressure and need for the state to address those dimensions and yet not be diverted from what it should have been its focus all along and what it has often failed to do, which is addressing the insecurity in poor areas and delivering what the basic needs of citizens in those areas. And let me make one final point and then hand over to you. And that final point is to think about another side of organized crime. And that's the emergence and expansion of Chinese organized crime groups across the region. They are interacting with the Mexicans. In fact, we see very significant thickening of relationship between Mexican and Chinese criminal groups, some of which are potentially new sources of conflict, but a lot of which are essentially collaborative relationship. But we are also seeing just massive increase in the involvement of Chinese criminal groups in logging, mining, in ports, in infrastructure, in the expansion of connections, or on the tails of the expansion of connections between ports on the Pacific side of Latin America, of the Southern Cone, and China. And, in Asia as well, powerful Chinese criminal groups like the 14K Triad and many others often don't act with great deals of violence. Just like in Europe, violence levels are 1 per 100,000 in East Asia. But that doesn't mean that the groups don't have a lot of power. And the conduct of power is often different. It is much more through corruption, much more through building political relationship, and sometimes doing so also in ways that can be leveraged strategically by the Chinese government. So a much more complicated landscape from the old problem of slums and poor neighborhoods, now really combining to an unprecedented level with international dimensions and setting a lot of possibility for more violence, but certainly much more policing complexity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. It was a pleasure hearing you. The first point you mentioned is very interesting, how the city level becomes an international level. I mean, I've engaged in charity works a long time ago in somewhere when I lived in São Paulo, and these charity works were made through a priest, and every Christmas he asked me to go to this poor neighborhood in São Paulo, and every month I paid, let's say, minimum wage for that kid, so the family could pay the efforts for the kid, pay the study and food for the kid. But I wasn't willing to really visit the family. And the priest told me, the problem, he's an Italian priest, the problem he is not doing the charity, because doing charity is simple. The really problem you face in Brazil, I don't know, United States or France, the really problem, you have two countries, the poor one and the rich one. So it's not helping them, it's also helping you. Because every time you stop the car on a crossroads, somebody starts to rob you or steal something from you. That's because they do not recognize you as the same, on the same community. So going there and paying a visit to them is also telling you that you're a human being, and that you need to be respected as somebody that works and needs the money but you're doing the charity not because this is worthless to you, but because you have some love in your heart. So your analysis is very accurate from Brazilian perspective, because if you ask, I'm a professor of law, if you ask on the class who has been to Ceilândia, who has been to Águas Lindas, and most of the class never been to a part of the city because there's nothing there to do. There's no theaters, there's no church, there's nothing. So people who lives there come here, but you never go there. That's the same thing in São Paulo, in Rio, Salvador, almost our cities. That's our reality. I think France maybe Paris is the same, and some neighbors, but you need to know how violence brings up, and that's violence. It comes when you do not see the other as your equal. So violence has been growing up in Paris, I believe. I'm not Parisian, I never lived there, but I think because there's a lot of exclusion in the city. Being said that, let me talk a little bit in Portuguese, I beg your pardon, to express my reality as a judge. I'm a professor and a judge in a poor community which is very close. It's 20 minutes from here. A cidade é o Riacho Fundo. E o meu envolvimento com a segurança pública parte dessa experiência. Quando você senta na cadeira de um juiz, você vai ver violência doméstica, você vai ver homicídio, você vai ver roubo, você vê muitos crimes. Mas você não vê um crime. Em razão da característica do meu trabalho, eu não vejo o tráfico de drogas. Existe uma vara que é o tráfico de drogas. E existe uma outra vara que é para tráfico internacional. Comigo trabalham 2 promotores de justiça. Eles não, o que um vê, o outro não vê. O trabalho que a polícia militar faz, a polícia civil não vê. O que o juiz de drogas faz, eu não vejo. O que o juiz comum faz. Então, esse é o problema que nós enfrentamos na ponta da segurança pública. Ninguém tem uma visão do conjunto. No Riacho, há cerca de 10 anos, uma série de homicídios. As pessoas apareciam mortas e ninguém entendia por quê. O investigador começou a notar que essas mortes tinham uma característica em comum: pistolas automáticas. O uso de pistola automática é caro. Uma pistola custa 10 mil reais. E um revólver comum custa 700 reais. Então, eles percebiam que havia uma guerra. Mas eles não entendiam como essa guerra funcionava. Até que um dia morreu, assassinado, na frente do fórum, um acusado. Então pode, posso tocar o pau? Então tá bom. Então, esse homicídio aconteceu na frente do fórum e houve uma grande pressão por esclarecimento do que estava acontecendo. E, de fato, as investigações avançaram até que uma pessoa resolveu colaborar num acordo de delação premiada. E ele começa a dizer quem eram os dois lados. Então, ele narra a existência de uma organização criminosa em Brasília, que chama Comboio do Cão, que estava lutando pelo domínio do tráfico, e que existia uma outra organização no Gama, que era o opositor dele. Então, ele começa a narrar, morreu esse nesse dia, porque era a briga assim, morreu esse naquele dia, porque era a briga de outro jeito, e começa a descrever cada uma das mortes. Então, os investigadores descobrem e acusam cerca de 100 pessoas de integrar essa organização criminosa que chama Comboio do Cão. Como a maioria de vocês deve saber, onde o PCC não está no Brasil, nem o Comando Vermelho está, nasce uma organização local para controlar o tráfico de drogas. A nossa polícia é muito avançada, os meios de investigação não tem comparação com outros locais. Então, a gente se mantém a organização criminosa sob observação, mas mesmo do presídio, eles conseguem enviar ordens e controlar o tráfico de drogas no DF. A partir da investigação do Comboio do Cão, o que nós percebemos? Que o trabalho deles, o lucro deles é droga. Eles vivem de droga. A droga é a maconha que vem do Paraguai e a cocaína que vem da Bolívia. Como é a logística de trazer essa droga? A logística de trazer essa droga é o roubo de carro que acontece na nossa cidade. Ele rouba o carro, ele leva para a periferia, que é o entorno, Águas Lindas, Valparaíso, que já é no estado de Goiás. Esses carros são maquiados e preparados para uma viagem até Ponta Porã. Eles contratam uma pessoa que leva o carro até Ponta Porã. Em Ponta Porã, eles deixam um carro roubado e trocam por um carro que já vem carregado. O carro que vem carregado vem com 7 pistolas, uma metralhadora ou 250 quilos de maconha. Essa droga custava na época cerca de R$750, hoje custa R$1.000 o quilo da maconha em Ponta Porã. Ela vai ser vendida aqui pelo dobro. Esse carro, o carro é preparado porque se você bota muito peso no carro, o carro vem baixo e a polícia identifica. Então o carro é preparado para receber muita droga que vem escondida e ela vem até Goiás. É a razão pela qual Goiás é um centro importante de distribuição da droga para todo o país. Eles parcelam uma droga em Goiás, geralmente a preço de Goiás ou no próprio entorno, e a droga entra em pequenas porções de volta em Brasília. E assim o tráfico acontece. A cada biqueira, a cada ponto de droga, é 20 mil a 40 mil por semana. Então é importante entender a lógica do crime, a lógica econômica do crime. É 20 a 40 mil por semana. Então é muito dinheiro. Sem dinheiro você não consegue comprar arma pesada. Sem comprar arma pesada você não consegue matar o seu opositor. Arma pesada, pistola, metralhadora, .50, que é capaz de derrubar o helicóptero e furar o carro blindado. Você conseguiu comprar uma .50, o que você faz? Você aluga a .50 para o chamado novo cangaço que acontece no interior do Brasil. Tá? Quem é o traficante? O traficante é uma pessoa, eles chamam coroa, é uma pessoa de 40 anos, já é um criminoso velho para os padrões, que não tem antecedentes criminais. O que o traficante, como é que o crime acontece? O crime acontece assim: o usuário deve R$1.000, R$2.000 para o traficante. O traficante fala: se você não me pagar na próxima semana, eu vou te matar. Obviamente, o traficante contrata alguém para matar sempre que ele precisa. É o sicário que a professora comentou. Tem sempre um sicário do lado. A pessoa normalmente vem e fala: eu não tenho, ou ela paga, contrata uma agiota, ou ela pega empréstimo, ela vende alguma coisa. Mas ela traz, quando ela não traz, ela fala assim: você vai roubar um carro para mim, eu não tenho dinheiro para pagar. O traficante fala: como você não tem dinheiro, você vai praticar um crime para mim, você vai roubar um carro. Mas eu nunca roubei carro, como é que eu vou roubar carro? Eu tenho um menor de idade aqui que sabe roubar o carro, sabe abrir o carro, mas ele não sabe dirigir. Então você vai dirigir o carro e você vai deixar numa determinada praça. E a chave vai ficar num determinado local. Então, mas eu não tenho arma para roubar, como é que eu... A arma está com uma terceira pessoa, aí pode ser esses... como chama esse colecionador de armas? Esses colecionadores de arma, né? O CAC, né? CAC, que tem autorização para comprar arma. Geralmente são policiais que têm a arma. Então, quando escuta, ele fala assim: se pegar arma, pega todos os homicídios. Mas geralmente as armas estão com a própria polícia. Polícia geralmente não do DF, mas regiões. Então, você pega a arma, pega o menor, escolhe o carro, rouba, entrega numa praça. Da praça, o carro, um terceiro vem pegar o carro, as chaves já estão ali, leva o carro para o entorno e o ciclo começa de novo. Então, todo o ciclo do roubo do carro, do assalto às pessoas, essas fraudes de internet, tudo isso só tem uma finalidade: capital para comprar droga e aí fazer rodar a área econômica onde o lucro é maior. E o traficante é essa pessoa como nós, ele não faz nada, ele é um empresário do crime. Mas não tenham dúvidas, eles são os mais frios assassinos que existem. A vida do traficante é dormir com uma pistola, pensando que se ele não matar, o assessor dele vai matá-lo para tomar o local. Então, essa é a narrativa, vamos dizer, de um juiz local sobre o que acontece todos os dias na nossa cidade, sobre os homicídios que estão acontecendo agora, sobre tudo que está acontecendo agora, que advém de uma segregação social extrema, de uma incapacidade do nosso sistema público de entender o que efetivamente acontece. Essa é a minha narrativa. Thank you very much. I reclaim my poor English to express my gratitude to talking to you here. But I thought I would be able to express better in Portuguese than English, because I do speak English, but some words sometimes skips, and I miss my entire work. I beg your pardon for talking Portuguese. So let's go to the questions. Professor Brown came from United States. This is a far of a trip to coming here to Brasilia. I expect you have questions to her. I express my thoughts about Brazilian splitted society, but I'm certain you have questions. Queridos, perguntas para a professora Brown.
Podem fazer em português, se quiserem. Eu traduzo.
Por favor.
Meu nome é Davi. I'd like to ask you a question about a correlated theme. I'd like to know what is your point of view regarding the relationship between organized crime and urban violence and the war on drugs, considering that drug dealing is the standard way of financing those organizations.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I think we need to think about what the term war on drug means. It's a term that's used to describe a wide variety of practices. Now, it was originally coined to mean very harsh policies that centered on heavy incarceration of users, non-violent drug users, as well as dealers. And it is sometimes used, however, to, those policies were enormously problematic, deeply counterproductive, and certainly didn't achieve the goal of either reducing drug use or reducing criminality. But it is sometimes also used to simply apply to any counter-narcotics policy, and is used as a shorthand to say that drugs should be legalized, all drugs should be legalized, from fentanyl to heroin, or perhaps some drugs should be legalized. So I think we need to kind of unpack the term. So clearly, those old approaches that might still be very dominant and often embraced by politicians of heavy focus on incarceration that would end up being frequently the incarceration of low-level dealers, of users, are problematic, counterproductive. Similarly, if by the shortcut war on drugs one means high-value targeting, going after the heads of capos and not dismantling, not being able to tackle the middle operational layer of crime groups, that has been very problematic too. It has driven enormous violence levels in Mexico, as the high-value targeting broke up established territory, splintered groups, but never brought the state and deterrent law enforcement forces, not law enforcement forces with robust deterrence capacity. Now, this problem is far more acute in Latin America than in Asia, where overwhelmingly very doctrinaire, very rigid policies, heavily focused on incarcerations, are in place, yet violence levels are very minimal. To the extent that homicides, violence is perpetrated, it is often at the hands of the police. In the most egregious form, this would be Philippines under Rodrigo Duterte, but Thailand has had its versions and iterations of these approaches. But the criminal groups in Asia tend to be very non-violent. If you end up with the tongs pushing violence levels to 100 people per year, it's an enormous level by East Asian standards. Now, Mexico said, look, the war on drug doesn't work. And so under the president of López Obrador, over the past 6 years, the Mexican government has essentially given up on any kind of law enforcement policy toward the cartels, toward criminal groups more broadly. I exaggerate personal, such as against oil theft. That was something that mattered very much to President López Obrador because of the way he envisioned to finance the state. But short of oil theft, there really has been no application of police arrests to criminal groups in Mexico. Every so often, under pressure from the United States, the Mexican government would arrest someone like Ovidio, one of the Chapitos, one of the leaders of the Sinaloa cartel. But by and large, you had no police opposition to the state, the military to the criminal groups. The military would be deployed, and the National Guard would be deployed across Mexico, and they would stand on the corner and do nothing. You would have firefight, invisible distance just around the corner. You would have criminal groups like Jalisco employing drones and dropping bombs to drive populations out of territories. And and the National Guard would do nothing. So the extreme swing of the war on drugs would be no policing at all. And this has an absolutely disastrous consequences for Mexico, where criminal groups are taking over ever larger portions of territories, legal economies, formal institutions, and are enormously influencing elections. So to me, the issue is really not, do we focus on illegal economies? Do we focus on urban violence? But it's how do we do it to minimize the harms that organized crime, illegal economies generate, but also to minimize how the police policy, the public policies, law enforcement policies generate themselves. And what I was saying in my talk is that that old cop-out that was so comfortable with as long as one group has become dominant, drives homicides down, we can relegate the rule of a poor area to that organized crime group is no longer, because some of these organized crime groups, PCC, like Sinaloa, are not satisfied to rule just the slum. They want to rule much larger portions of the country. They want to infiltrate the state, and they are operating at an international level.
So, I'm sorry I was late, but so do you really think that we can fight drug trafficking? Because one of the issues that we have is that we have seen an increasing demand of drugs in almost every country in Latin America, and well, in the US it's changing. So if the market is growing in terms of the demand, how are we going to be able, after 30 years of the war on drugs, to actually fight the traffic of it?
So, Lucia, not only do I think that we need to fight drug trafficking, I think we need to try drug trafficking organizations. And I also don't believe in just uniform legalization. I have no problem with legalization of cannabis, but I certainly would be deeply opposed to legalization of fentanyl. I mean, the United States is going through the most lethal drug epidemic ever in history as a result of a poorly regulated legal drug market that originated with pharmaceutical opioids. And synthetic drugs in general, and particularly synthetic opioids, bring a level of devastation unseen in anything like heroin or cocaine because of the potency that just changes not only the lethality, the mortality rate for users to unprecedented levels, but also changes radically how criminal groups can operate, gives them just far greater playing scope. So then the question is, if I don't believe that we should just legalize all drugs and we should just allow drug trafficking to take place, we should just have a hands-off approach like the government of President López Obrador has, what do we do? The question is, how do we go about it? So let me then kind of raise few aspects of what I think is should be elements of law enforcement strategies. One is we need to beyond solely seizures, or even seizures, and in principle conceive of seizures as a mechanism to drive price down. That has not worked with plant-based drugs and is completely with synthetic-based drugs because it's just so easy to produce and so enormously cheap to produce. Moreover, the evasion, the detection challenge is much greater. It takes less than 1/10 of fentanyl to supply the entire U.S. market that it would take in heroin, or in cocaine for that matter. So the amount of drugs that you need to smuggle is very small, and the amount of losses you can afford as a drug trafficker are enormous. Your production levels are so cheap and can be so easy. Now instead, I want to think about addiction as this layers of groups. And particularly, I would suggest focusing on the middle operational layer. Now, this is not going to stop the flow of drugs to users. But it will, at minimum, if designed effectively, reduce the power of organized crime to grow into ever larger places. So I want drug traffickers to behave like the Sinaloa cartel behaves in the United States and not like it behaves in Mexico. Now, ideally, I would not want the Sinaloa cartel to be in the United States. But if it is in the United States, if I need to deal with dealers, I want them to be essentially nonviolent. I want them to be as separated from society. So yeah, you will go to your dealers to buy yourself the drug, but you are not going to rely on the dealers to settle your dispute with your neighbor as to how high the fence should be and where your neighbor's territory, your neighbor's gardens and my garden starts. There is no social public services governance to the behavior of criminal groups. And finally, I want the criminal groups to have very limited capacity to infiltrate politics and infiltrate legal and state institutions. That requires action. If you just let them be, they will take over. They will become the mafias. They will get into logging. They will get into fishing. Now, the question is then what do you do with use? And clearly, arresting users is a bad policy, especially arresting nonviolent users. But you also don't just want any drug to be available. Again, the lethality, the social consequences of synthetic opioids emerging are so radically different than cocaine and heroin, and yet they're almost inevitable, in my view, that they will spread. We are seeing nitazines emerging in Europe. Now, so, in the United States, right now, we will not get away from fentanyl. We are with synthetic opioids, and that means enabling drug overdose, it means all kinds of other policies, but none of it is sufficient in the context of 100. It's a different problem for Britain, for the Netherlands, when nitazines are just popping up. There, my priority, if I were running law enforcement, would be the moment you have some nitazine, some synthetic opioids, be it fentanyl, emerging, you crush those networks. You dismantle those networks. You prioritize these type of synthetic drugs over other crimes, over other drug dealings. Now, even so, in my view, it's a flood that will come. We are, for the first time, seeing the Nandareta speaking about experimenting with developing fentanyl markets in Europe. Certainly, the Mexicans are pushing in methamphetamine, producing methamphetamine in Europe. They're bringing methamphetamine to Australia, New Zealand, across Middle East. The synthetic drugs revolution is upon us, and it will generate devastating consequences. Latin America might actually be sort of way on the entail of before this hits Europe, before it hits Asia-Pacific markets, in my view. And ideally, I wish it didn't come. I wish it didn't break out of the North America space. But it's already starting to.
We are almost out of time. Short question. Uma última pergunta. Então, senhores, eu gostaria de agradecer imensamente a presença da doutora Felbab-Brown. Uma pergunta?
Thank you very much. It's not going to be brief, but I will request a brief response. You are focusing on the United States and the problems that generate in the United States, but you are optimistic that a good government in Mexico or in other places can dismantle criminal organizations because the experience is that they are not able to. Known other experiments in Latin America, besides the one of Bukele, that is another story, can reduce homicides and can reduce crimes consistently and over time. Mexico tried the war on drugs very heavily with Calderon, and they failed. So what leads you to believe that there is the deterrence forces in deterrence policy in Latin America can work?
Well, Marcelo, tough question. So I guess. So I'm well aware of the enormous challenges that law enforcement in Latin America has faced. That doesn't mean that there has been no progress. We certainly have progress in Colombia. It's very imperfect. There are very many challenges, both with the quality of police reform to what's happening with crime, but it's not as bad as the 1990s. So progress might not be linear, it might not be sufficiently fast, but I am at least hopeful that things can become better. Now, they're also becoming worse at the same time. We were having places that have traditionally been the islands of peace, the Ecuadors, the Costa Ricas, the Chiles, all of a sudden experiencing very dramatic violence, not because of drug trafficking per se, but because of the behavior of drug trafficking groups in those areas. But I guess the alternative is, if one were to assume, or were to make one's assumption that progress cannot be achieved, then we are going to be living with narco states, with crime states. Maybe we are already. I think that is bad for people. So ultimately, these criminal groups are violent, unaccountable. They are a form of authoritarian rule that is different than an authoritarian politician, but they are not nice, accountable entities. They are enormously intrusive to people's lives. I go back to what conditions would need to emerge for the state and the people to develop the will to be pushing forward. And in Mexico, we still have egregiously high levels of violence, not just homicides, but also disappearances that have increased dramatically despite 5 years, almost 6 years of do nothing. So I find that do nothing approach very problematic, but I'm very conscious that one cannot be indifferent to violence generated by state policies. I was a big critic of Calderon. I was a big critic of high-value targeting, and meeting with his top officials in 2009, 2008, and saying this policy will run aground because you need to control the violence. You cannot just say, oh, it's criminals killing criminals. It will just blow up the entire policy. And it's, of course, terrible for people who need to live with the violence.